Hi, I'm Ted Haftegaber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see.
So, why grief? Let's get right to it.
Let's start with why Alua. There's nobody else I would want to be on this stage with today. When putting a new book out in the world is kind of like a birthday. It's a birthday of the book, but it feels kind of akin to that. So I'm just so happy to be here with you. I want to tell a quick story.
Okay.
We'll get into grief, but hang on. Well, we'll start with grief. I was in my my grief therapy office. What was it? 8 years ago?
8 years ago.
8 years ago, and I had a woman come to see me, and she was dying of cancer. She'd been struggling with cancer for many years, and ups and downs with it, but she had finally really reached an end point with her journey of treatments, and she came to my office, and she sat down across from me, and she was about my age, a little bit older, and she told me that she had a son the same age as my oldest daughter, and she wanted me to help her figure out how to say goodbye to him. And at the time, both of our kids were like in second grade. It turned out, as we spoke in this session, that she lived in Santa Monica, where I live, and her son went to the local public elementary school where my daughter went. Turned out they were in the same classroom, and I had never met her because she was sick at home so often. I was at the school a lot. At the end of that session, she left, and I've sat with so many people in grief, and I don't usually, it just brought up so much. It was my worst fears, having to say goodbye to my kids. I lost my mom really early, and I sat there in the office after she left, and I thought, I need help with this one. And I had been hearing about death doulas, but I didn't know too much about them, and I thought, I need a death doula. And I Googled death doulas LA.
Like you do.
And this was the first woman who popped up. So I emailed Alua and I said, hey, what's up? Do you want to meet sometime and have a coffee? What happened from there?
Well, I said, first I was like, who is this rando in my inbox who wants to hang out and talk about grief and loss? But I said yes. It took a few months, though. Claire was traveling and had some kid stuff, and her life seemed so full, but we found time to finally sit down and meet. We met at Cafe Gratitude for lunch, and what I thought was going to be a really quick lunch turned into, 8 years. But at the time, we shared several bottles of wine.
I think it was like 2.
At least. At least. We laughed a lot. We talked a lot about grief and death and loss. We talked about this world that we found ourselves in. But more than anything, I think we found a common ground to people that care deeply about humans and our ride here and all the things that impact it, mostly the end of it and how we all approach the end. And then it also really helped that Claire is just 1 week older than I am. So as somebody older and wiser than I'm younger and fresher, less close to death apparently. But we discovered that we're just a week apart in age, but also that we sit often on opposite sides of the same issue looking at it, me being on supporting people into death, and Claire being there after a death to support. But also Claire with her small earrings and her gray cardigans, and me with my million colors on at the same time.
I dressed up for Alua tonight. Not for you guys, for Alua.
And I dressed to match you. We did a good job. But it was really refreshing to meet somebody who had such a thoughtful perspective on grief across the board. I find that Claire's perspective has been unique, primarily because of your life experience and your background. Would you like to share?
Sure. When I was 14, both of my parents got cancer at the same time. I'm an only child, and my mother died when I was 18. I had just started college, and I wasn't there the night she died, which became something that I struggled with and grappled with for so many years. I, at times, wanted to crawl out of my own skin with regret and remorse that I wasn't there with her when she died. But I was also facing my father's death, and he died 7 years later. They had very different deaths. My mom's death was very medicalized. She was seeking treatments up until the very end and really had a lot of reluctance about facing the end of her life, which meant that I did too. And my father didn't really talk about it. She and I didn't talk about it. We didn't say goodbye. Her death came as a surprise to me, even though she had been so ill for so many years, because we just didn't do anything to really face it together. And when my father was dying, both he and I really wanted a different approach to that. My dad, he was 57 when I was born. He was a World War II bomber pilot, POW, and he just really wanted to go into the end of his life with a lot of presence, and he asked me to do that with him. And it was the last great gift he ever gave me. I kind of went kicking and screaming. I mean, he kept sitting me down at the table in the months and even the years leading up to his death, and he would have me make all these lists. He was like, okay, here's a note card and a pen. And I was like, he was like, write down, what are the first 5 things you have to do right after I die? And I was like, what? And he was like, call the mortuary, number 1. I was just like, oh my God. He was like, you need at least 7 copies of the death certificate. You're gonna need them for all kinds of stuff. He had been having me put my name on his bank accounts and go through all of the paperwork. It was awful. I kept crying and trying to resist it. I still have that note card, and it has tear stains on it. Mm. But what was the first thing I did when he died? I got out the note card, and I called the mortuary. And then I smoked a cigarette.
Yeah, for sure. Number 2.
Yeah, that was my number 2. But his death was so beautiful in so many ways. He had hospice care, and I was there with him holding his hand when he took his last breaths. And it was such a different experience than my mother, not only because I wasn't there with her, but just because we had really walked into his death together. We had said the things that we needed to say, and he made a lot of choices about the way he wanted to die. He wanted to be at home. He, really wanted very little care and treatment, and it was beautiful. It was so beautiful. But then I was 25 and I was alone, and that was really scary and really hard. And it was this time in my life when all of my peers were also 25, but they were post-college and they were partying and they were hanging out in new apartments and getting new jobs, and it was just a really different experience for me. I had all these massive questions, these big existential life questions, like, what the fuck are we doing here? Mm-hmm. And it was just a lonely, scary time, and there was no one around me that was talking about grief or helping me look at it or helping me explore my grief. It was more the message like, okay, you're an adult now, let's move on, let's get on with it. My friends really struggled to meet me in my grief because they didn't know it. They didn't know how to be there, didn't know what it was like. And so I felt very alone in it for a long time. Finally went to therapy, which was helpful. And, I think one of the things that is so interesting to me about grief, and is really what this book is about, is that there is so much opportunity in grief. There's a lot of opportunity for growth, for really realizing what matters to us, what's meaningful to us. And so very quickly I realized what wasn't meaningful to me, so many things, people, jobs. I had always wanted to be a writer. And at the time that he died, I was working as a travel writer and a food writer. So I was going to all these fancy hotels and fancy restaurants and writing reviews, which sounds really cool and was at one point. But it just became so meaningless, in the face of so much loss and how lonely I was. And so I quit doing all of those things. I started working for nonprofits. I worked for this homeless organization that helped get homeless people back into the job place and helped them with resumes and took them out to job interviews, and then I worked with underserved school kids, and then I decided to go back and get my master's in clinical psychology, and my first job out of that was hospice. And I went into that thinking I knew grief, but I only knew my grief.
Right. What have you learned since then?
It's all right here. It's in the book. Just read the book. I put everything I know about grief in this book. I really tried, in a very gentle, compassionate, not overwhelming way.
Would you like to read from it?
Sure.
Yay. Her 5th book, y'all. 5.
I haven't read from this except for Jerry. We just recorded our audiobooks, and we ended up at the same studio. We have different publishers, but somehow we ended up in the same studio. It was a very sweet experience. I've only read for Jerry, and now for you. Oh, that's not the right section. Okay. This is from part 1, Entering into Grief. And it starts with an invitation. Someone you love is gone, and you are holding this book because you don't know what else to do. That's okay. You don't have to know what to do. You don't have to be good at this. You don't even have to want to do this. All you have to do is keep breathing. Just be here. I know that's hard when the person you love isn't. It may even feel impossible in certain moments. But grief is something all of us innately know how to do. It's not something you can prepare for or need to feel ready for. It is simply grief. In the beginning, grief is a conflicting, amorphous mess of an experience. One minute you're fine, the next you're on the floor heaving. That's okay. In fact, it's normal. And one day, a ways out from now, you may even feel a strange gratitude for who you have become through grief. But here's the thing to know about grief. It's not an affliction. It's not an ailment. It's not something you need to get over or rush through. Grief is part of the very real experience of being human. Grief is part of our lives all the time. You've grieved before, even if it didn't feel quite like this. And you'll grieve again. We all will. Grief is a natural part of our lives, and the process of grieving isn't sorry. That was like the word I wasn't going to mess up. And the process of grieving is integral to our experience of moving through the world. At its core, grief is about loss, and loss is about change. And change is never easy. Losing someone we love changes everything. It changes our identity, it changes our relationships, it changes the way we see the world. Loss changes the future, and sometimes even the past. And although this kind of change is sometimes unbearable, the only way to move through it is to lean into it. In this book, I'm going to help you do just that. Lean into the anguish. Lean into all the ways in which your world is changing. I know it might seem scary, like the ground might open up and swallow you whole, like you may never stop crying, but you will not fall through the floor, and you will eventually stop crying. Trust me, the alternative is much harder. All that aching, blinding pain you feel is not going to simply disappear if you run from it or ignore it. It will just be there waiting for you. And in the meantime, it will have spilled out anyway, in all kinds of other agonizing ways that are immeasurably disrupting your life. Let me say it again. Grief isn't something to get over. It's not something you can ignore or stifle or put a Band-Aid on. It's not going anywhere until it's had its way with you. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's certainly not going to hurt any more than it already does. Grieving is a natural process. It's not something to rush or tidy up. Grief is not going to adhere to any timelines or formulas. Grief is a human response to losing someone or something that mattered deeply to you. When you think about it that way, wouldn't it be weird if you weren't grieving? But grief isn't always easy, I know. It's messy and mercurial, and it doesn't follow instructions. That's because losing someone we love is wildly painful, more so than we ever could have imagined. We want the pain to go away. We want our person back. We want the world to stand still. We want to be held. We want to be left alone. We are scared. We are wounded animals lashing out at anyone and anything that approaches. We worry that we will never be the same again, and we won't. But here's the thing. You don't have to do anything except open up to your experience. The easiest way to do that is to invite your grief in. Pull up a chair for it even. Maybe make it some tea. Get yourself a cozy blanket and curl up so you can listen to what your grief has to say.
I mean, don't you just want Claire reading it to you when you're in the midst of the darkest, hardest time? Golly, it would make it so much easier, but gratefully you have the book. Okay, so a few things that I've picked up from your work over the years, and certainly with this book, is the potential for grief to be an opportunity, an experience that changes us, but not necessarily for the worse, but rather could open up other things in our lives. And I heard it from this passage in particular. And yet, still, even though I think some people understand that intellectually, the emotional process just to allow grief to come in feels so overwhelming. Mm-hmm. How do you suggest that people open to allow themselves to grieve?
I think a lot of times we need support in that. So it's not something that I think we have to do alone. I think so many people try to go it alone, and it can be really scary and overwhelming. Like you said, it can be an experience unlike anything you've ever had before. I mean, I think sometimes when we go through really profound loss, we've never felt that amount of emotions. Yeah. You know, we've never had the amount of life changes that come with certain losses. And that in and of itself is so overwhelming. It's very disorienting. Life looks different. Our worlds are different. And I think just starting there, letting that be true, so often we fight it, right? We're trying to get our hands around it. We're trying to make it different. We're trying to get through it quicker. We're trying to be better. But just meeting ourselves where we are in the mess of it is the first place to start. But I do think it's really important to be able to talk about it. I think grief needs community, whether that's, you know, going to a support group or therapy, or even just, you know, going on Instagram and reading other people's posts and thoughts about it, just so you don't feel so alone. There was none of that when I was going through it in my early days. There was no social media, there were very few books, and I just felt like the only person in the world who had lost a parent, you know, nobody my age had. And so when I began to meet other people and kind of find community and find ways to talk about it, that was really healing. Writing about it is an amazing way to do it. I always love writing.
Obviously, 5 books in. I'd hope you love it. You want to tell us about your process? How do you write about grief? How does one write about grief?
Tell us about your book
and
the writing
God.
About it. Alua just finished her first book.
I did. Yay. Yay. As we've talked about before, I don't consider myself a writer necessarily. People would be like, ask Claire for tips. And I'd be like, what? No, not her. She loves this. I was just kind of white-knuckling it all the way through. But I did enjoy the process where I got to be in my emotional experience. It's a memoir. My book is a memoir. It talks about my journey into deaf care, and then weaves in some client stories and also general thoughts about how we live and how we die throughout it. But I really enjoyed thinking about where I was at the time or what was happening in my life and creating some context around it and pulling out sensory detail and emotional detail in order to get clear what it is that I'm talking about, in the hope that the reader will also understand and be able to identify with it themselves. That part was fun. The rest of it, not my jam, not my jam, which is another part of the reason I'm so in awe of you and all that you've done with your writing, because it's quite a feat.
I have always loved it. I've been writing since I was a little kid. I just, I like to communicate. I have a lot to say, I guess, but I really I feel like it's just a way I think, did you use the word alchemize?
I did.
You did. You used the word alchemize about my book, and I think that's a really great word. I mean, it's like I sit every day with people who are going through profound loss, and what I hear and what I see them going through, I really want to convey. You know, my last book was called Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief, and it was just all about the connection between anxiety and grief, and I wasn't seeing that talked about anywhere.
At all.
And I had to write about it. I had to put it out there. It felt so important to just communicate about it. Mm-hmm. I loved writing this book because I didn't write about myself at all. I'm in the introduction, a little bit about my background, but the entire book is written to you. And it's in second person, and it was really nice to not write about myself.
Yeah, I can imagine. After writing a memoir. One of the things that I really enjoyed about this book when I read it, and I trust that you will too, if you don't already have it, please do get it, but that it feels like a friend, a companion, like something to hold on to in the midst of those really, really challenging times. And the way that you're able to do so effortlessly so that people don't feel so alone in this process seems to me to be a big portion of how you approach the work overall. What are your hopes about how people will use this book?
I just want it to be hopeful and reassuring and to feel compassion for themselves. You know, I'm always astounded by how many people come to me and the first thing they say is that they're doing it wrong.
No.
I'm grieving wrong. I'm doing it wrong. I'm crying too much. I'm not crying enough. I skipped a stage, or I don't get the stages, or, everyone around me tells me I should be over this by now, and I'm not. And I just want the book to be something that makes people feel okay about where they are in their grief process.
Yeah, because as we know, it's all okay.
It is okay. It's absolutely okay. I think grief can be really beautiful. There's so much out there about grief, but there are a lot of takes on it that it's just an affliction, that it's something that we really have to get over or move through. And I wanted this book to be hopeful. I know it's hard to hear about hope and transformation when you are in the new throes of a big loss. You don't want that. You don't want to feel hopeful, maybe. You don't want to think about transforming through your grief, You just want your person back, and you want to go back to who you used to be, and you want your life back. But I think it's important to be able to hold both, to be able to really recognize and sit with our pain, and also have the awareness that there is an opportunity here. I mean, you know this just as well as I do from all of your experiences. All my losses and all the grief and all the pain I've endured have only served to teach me more about myself, about life, change my view of the world, give me more compassion and understanding. And it's been a really beautiful experience. It wasn't in the beginning. I mean, it was horrible. But,
yeah.
Over time, it really became something so beautiful and important, and it infuses my daily life. Can you share a little bit about what got you into your work? Because I know we're coming from such similar places.
Sure. A few years back, 10 to be precise, 11, I was working as a lawyer at the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, and I grew a very, very thick depression, but it wasn't thick at all. In fact, I was very thin. I was sick. I hadn't been eating, couldn't figure out how to care for myself. And I took a medical leave of absence from work. I went to Cuba, where I met a fellow traveler on a bus who had uterine cancer, and we talked a lot about her life. And then I don't know what compelled me to start asking her about dying. It was either hubris or still being hungover or still being intoxicated. I don't know what. But I asked her questions, and she answered. So I kept asking her questions, and she kept answering. And I was stunned at the depth of inquiry, the depth of presence that she had with the potential for her death from this disease that she had. And she shared with me that it was the first time that anybody had made space for her to talk about death, with the potential. And that made me really sad for her. It made me really sad for all of us, in fact. I think similarly, Claire, I share a desire that people aren't alone in their hardest moments. And then I was really sad for her. I also started thinking about my own mortality in that conversation, and realized that if my disease of depression killed me, that I was not pleased with the life that I'd had up until then, and so desperately wanted to make a change. And I thought that I could maybe talk to people about the fact that they were going to die. For some reason, that seemed like a good idea. 11 years ago, hungover on this bus in Cuba. But then I came back to the United States, and I read everything death-related I could get my hands on. I noticed that it was coming from a particular lens, though, but I was still fascinated enough to continue leaning into the conversation. But then 6 months after I came back from Cuba, my brother-in-law, my older sister's husband, was diagnosed with Burkitt's lymphoma, and I got to support him through the end of his life. And being present for Peter in his dying was a tremendous gift. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, and it was transformative in a way. The grief certainly was. The dying process allowed me to see how isolating it is, how difficult it is for us walking. It feels like we're walking alone. Intellectually, I understood that there were thousands of people going through the same thing, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like we were the only ones on the planet. And it also didn't feel like there was much support for it. I didn't know where to turn for it. So after that, I decided that I could do something about that, at least be with people in their experience. So we started a doula practice after gaining training from Olivia Barham, Reverend Olivia Barham at Sacred Crossings Institute here in LA. And not long after that, I began Going with Grace, which is the end-of-life planning and training organization that I currently run, and through which I had the pleasure of meeting Claire. I want to touch on hope real quick, because oftentimes hope is a tricky thing at the end-of-life space. Often I find people hoping for a miracle, hoping for a cure, or hoping that this doesn't last too long, or hoping for something that isn't really possible. And often I encourage people to reframe what they think of as hope, because in the case of grief, for example, I think that the invitation is to hope for, well, I'll ask you what that is, but for me anyway, I think that sometimes people hope that they can just move through it and put it aside and get done with it. But what is it that you think that we can hope for through grief?
I think we can hope for it to open us up to a truer version of ourselves. I think that when we go through profound loss, again, it's change. We get pared down to our essence in so many ways. What really matters to us? What is the life we want to live going forward? How are we going to survive this loss? What do we need to do to survive it? What do we know about ourselves that can pull us through? What do we know about the world, about love? I think that there's so much to be found in thinking about why we grieve. People ask me all the time, isn't my work sad or heavy or depressing? And yeah, it's sad sometimes, really sad. And I hear stories that are heartbreaking. However, what I also hear is love and relationships and connection, and that's why we're grieving. And some of the stories I hear, most of the stories I hear, are so touching. They're just so profound that we get to be here with each other at all, and that we get this time and we get this love, and there's just so much beauty there. And I think when we can recognize that, it can change our view of every moment.
Yeah. One of the things that I love so much is how you talk about alchemizing grief, about the blossom that can come from this devastating loss that for many feels like the worst thing. Why would anybody ever want to do that? But to hear you talk about it, it could be like a spring bed, something to bounce off of into something else.
Yeah, it really is. I see it happen a lot in connection. So when people come together in their grief, I run a bunch of support groups, and I just love, I have a support group for moms who've lost children of all different ages. Some were babies, some were in their 20s, 30s even. And these moms come together every week, and they can talk to each other and look at each other in this way that they can't do anywhere else in their world. And to see the way that they're able to connect, and to see the way that they can be truly who they are in this new experience of loss with each other is so beautiful and profound. And they feel it too. Even in the pain that they're in, they also feel this beauty of that kind of connection, of being together in that way.
I think that grief often shows us who we really are, but it also allows us to meet people for who they really are as well.
Yeah.
I'm sure many of you have had the experience of grief yourselves, or when somebody's grieving, and when you get to show up and support them in that space, and they show you their fullness, their richness, the depth of their emotion. I fall in love with people all the time that show me who they are, who show me where it hurts, or show me what it is that they're working through. Similarly, I find that it's a wonderful opportunity to really get to know somebody, and also to see the best of humankind.
Yeah.
Truly.
No, I feel like you and I are so lucky. We get to meet people at their most human selves, you know? Maybe they're in exquisite pain. Maybe they're in some kind of truth that they hadn't been able to face until now. Maybe they're angry, maybe they're working through a mistake or a regret, but it's so often their most human experience of just themselves when they're facing those things. I think when we resist those truths about ourselves, that is when things go awry. That's the only way to do it wrong, is to push it away, to fight it, to really kind of struggle with it or try to control it. When we do that, it so often just becomes anger, anxiety, and when we're hurt, we lash out at others or ourselves, you know. Compassion for ourselves is so important in this.
What are the ways that you see that it comes out anyway when we try to resist or push it away?
Anxiety is like one of the most common ones. I really see so many people just become so fearful. They're fearful of themselves. They're fearful of their new worldview because they're not exploring it, you know. I think there's a way that in which we can stop trusting ourselves because, again, going back to that idea that in the beginning of grief, it can be so overwhelming. You don't know if you can go to work. You don't know if your knees are going to buckle walking across a room. You don't know if you can handle being at a party, being with people that you thought you loved and were comfortable with. You suddenly may feel squirrely around, you know? And so it's like this new version of yourself that you have to meet. And there's parts of that self that may feel really foreign and even uncomfortable in times. But I think learning to meet that new person with compassion and curiosity is really important. Having a lot of curiosity about this process. But then anxiety comes too because our sense of the world is different. Our whole sense of like the landscape of our lives, our future has changed. Our sense of safety and certainty disappears sometimes. But with that comes more opportunity for curiosity, you know? It's rare that I've met someone who's gone through a really significant loss and not questioned what happens after this, you know? Will I ever see that person again? Are they okay? Can they see me? What is this all about? And fighting those questions too just lends itself to more anxiety.
I remember particularly after my brother-in-law died, I could not for the life of me understand how the sun kept coming up. It's like, how is it doing that? Never before had I thought about it, but all of a sudden after his death, it was like, this is magic. And perhaps it was a way for me to hold on to like a really basic part of being human and being alive, something that I knew Peter could no longer access. But it brought me so much awe and wonder. And rife with that was the wonder and awe of death itself. And like what happens, the process for dying, this inexplicable moment when we are born, and then the one that we meet on the other side when we die, and what life is like without him in it. I still find myself being in awe that all this life has passed without him, and trying to understand how the world keeps going and how the sun keeps coming up, a new way to be in the world for myself too, which is laden with the curiosity. How does curiosity support us in being conscious with our grief?
Well, I think that I talk about this in the book, but when a big loss occurs in our life, it's something that happens to us. And grief is something, though, that I think we have agency over. We can choose how we're going to grieve, how we're going to engage with it, how we're going to support ourselves through it, how we're going to communicate about it. And so I think that just kind of being conscious and intentional and moving into it with that curiosity. What is it here to teach us? Rather than slamming the door on it and saying, no, I don't want to, which is normal too. We will always do that. It's so painful, and it's so many unanswerable questions, or at least they feel unanswerable a lot of the time. And so trying to just continue to open up that curiosity, even about the pain, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about, I heard you mention when you first started reading about loss and grief as an experience across the human spectrum. Can you talk a bit about that?
I mean, I think we're grieving all throughout our lifetimes. I think we experience grief very early on. You know, we lose pets, we move different homes, we say goodbye to a teacher and move on to a different school. You know, there's grief that we feel in those moments. We don't always recognize it as grief, and maybe it's not always as big as some of the other grief we go through, but we're always grieving, and I think we need to remember that. Like when I first started learning about anxiety, it was helpful for me to remember and to know that we're always a little anxious. Like anxiety is actually helpful. We're never supposed to not be completely not anxious. It serves us in many ways, and I think grief does the same. So to kind of find some comfort in the fact that we are always grieving in different ways, and that we know how to do it, we know how to feel it. It's part of our experience of being human.
Do you think being able to identify grief when we're doing it from like losing a job or leaving a partnership or something of the sort. Do you think being able to identify different types of grief allows us to sharpen the skill?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, we're trying to tidy it up so early. We're trying to shield our kids from it. We don't, have them come to memorials or funerals or sit bedside with people who are dying. We're still not very good at that. And I think when we do that, we're really robbing them of the ability to learn how to start grieving early on. If we started that so much earlier, I think we would be, much better at kind of riding the waves of it. I think one of the things that happens when we're newly grieving is that the grief rises up and it's so scary. But if we know how to ride those waves, even in little bits and pieces beforehand, we'll know that we can come through it and that we often really learn something when we do.
So fun. I mean, my love.
Surfing the grieve.
Yeah, my type of fun. I think probably
it's my fun too.
Yours too.
Here's my thing I want to tell you guys. Everybody that I know in this space that works in grief and end of life, they're often the most fun people I've ever met. Even when I was in hospice, oh my God, the doctors and the nurses, the social workers, the chaplain, the laughter and the lightness and the life living that goes on in these circles is profound. And Alua is the embodiment of that. Do you find that as well? And what do you think it is about this work that really makes us so fun?
Well, first of all, Claire, some of my most memorable professional experiences in my life have been with you. Often some dark night somewhere in a greenhouse when we're supposed to be doing something else, but we're giggling and being absurd and having the time of our lives. I think something about getting close consistently to death and loss and the inky part of being alive means that we're also able to access like the joy and the awe and the wonder of being alive much, much, much easier, which means that we can make a random night in a greenhouse in North Carolina be like the party central. I think that's what it has something to do with.
That was quite a night.
It was.
It's true. I think to sit with this work day in and day out, it's a constant awareness of how short life is, but how amazing it is too. My father, in his dying days, his last days, one of the very last things he said to me, he was talking less and less each day, and one of the very last days in which he spoke full sentences, he said, he said that we would never know how sweet life was if it didn't end. And it's true, and that it's always stayed with me. And I think if there were no ending and there were no goodbyes and we didn't have to think about the fact that we won't be here forever, then nothing would matter. And so the fact that it ends gives it so much meaning.
Absolutely. And greater opportunity to be here for what this is, all the full sensory experience that's available to our bodies, and the emotional ones too, including grief, including the heartache, including the depression, including the sadness, because that also comes with it, joy and awe and delicious treats.
Here's a last big question for you.
Me?
Yeah. I'll try to help you answer it, but I don't know if I can. But you and I come to this work after having gone through a lot of personal experiences in this realm, and I feel like that's where most of us really come into this awareness. Do you think there's a way for people who haven't gone through big loss or faced death and illness to really cultivate the same kind of awareness that we have? It's like the Matrix. It's like we woke up. We have this ability now, but can you do that without having to go through profound loss or face death?
Absolutely. I think what we need to do in order to support that is just to go outside and look up and look around and think about what an utter miracle it is that you exist to begin with, the profound odds it takes to be born, to survive in utero, to actually make it through the birth canal, to arrive here or however you came through, arrive here, to feel cold and to look at lemons on a tree and watch them fall, and the perfection in nature, the perfection in your body, even though it might not do all things, even though you may experience places where your body isn't as able. But the utter sheer miracle it is to be alive, even without the loss, even without thinking, wow, I got to take this in because I'm going to die, even without that, it still is utter magic. Yeah.
I love you.
I love you. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you both so much. I am really pleased to hear both of your perspectives. And I'm just curious, I have studied some of the work of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I'm curious what her work meant for both of you individually, and also what you think of her legacy today and how her work holds up today.
Claire.
I love Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She's been getting so much flack for her 5 stages, but you guys, she was a pioneer.
Right.
She was amazing. She was talking about this stuff when nobody else was. She was standing up in rooms full of men, and they didn't want to listen to her, and she was making them listen. She was working in a hospital in Chicago in the 60s, and she was, in a field absolutely dominated by men, and she was going around and she was sitting with patients who were dying, and she wanted to hear what it was like, how they felt emotionally and spiritually. And she really listened to them. And what she noticed was that the other doctors would just go around and check symptoms on a sheet and ask them about their physical condition. And she began to bring patients who were willing up on a stage and ask them in front of her whole medical community about how they felt about dying. And everybody began to learn so much more about all of that. That was where the 5 stages were born. The denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance were born out of what she was seeing in facing death. People were going through those stages while they were facing death, not grieving. And later, she applied them to the grieving process, and they don't work as well. And so people now throw them under the bus, but you can't throw her under the bus, too, because she was just incredible. So I am always grateful to her for laying the foundation for the work that you and I both do today.
Same. I think.
I love her. Sorry.
Yeah.
Get me worked up.
I love the framework that she created. I love that people can identify what their experience is because of the work that she did. I love that people can say, oh, I'm angry, and oh, that anger is grief. That's really helpful, really, really helpful. And yeah, I think it's spectacular that we're now also being able to see what she was actually trying to do when she initially did it, rather than how it was co-opted for everybody. But we'll forever be grateful for her and her legacy and her work. Yeah.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here tonight. I have a question about, similar to what you were saying, Claire, at the end, about how do we sort of get other people to sort of see the same light that maybe a lot of us have done here in this room already. We've done a lot of work with grief, or we've been through so much grief. How do we help those around us who are struggling with that to perhaps open up? I've read your books, and I've talked to you many times, and we're friends, but I really feel this, especially right now. There's so many things in the world to grieve, whether it's family or worldwide, but how the heck do we reach out to people, even just start the conversation to say, we all need to sit down and talk about this. This is a big thing that is happening. Or do we just say, my journey is my journey, and your journey is, it is what you want to do. So that's a very long question, sorry.
Well, I keep writing books trying to get the word out. No, I think sometimes we have to pick and choose who we're going to fight this battle against, because sometimes when we're grieving, I think we really need to protect our peace. That's a phrase that I use a lot and think is important, because I think it is unfortunately up to the people who are grieving and in end of life to educate everybody else. But when you're grieving, the last thing you want to be doing is trying to educate people about how to hold space for grief and talk about it. So I think it's important to kind of really choose who we really want to try to impress that upon. There are some people who are not worth it. And there are a lot of others who are. I have found that I've been doing so much grief community work with retreats and these support groups, and what I see in those communities is people coming together and recognizing all different kinds of grief and how real grief is and how valid it is. And once they've done that and they've sat in these rooms or Zoom rooms of sometimes real rooms of people who are grieving, they feel so much more empowered and they feel so much more compassionate for their own grief. And I think they become less afraid to talk about it, because we get so many messages from the outside about how long we should be able to grieve and how soon we need to move through it, that often we kind of listen and we go, okay, I'm doing this wrong. I should have been over this by now. But when you've sat in these rooms and you're able to go back out into the world and you say, you know what? No, you're wrong. I'm still grieving. I need more bereavement leave. Thank you very much. And so I think that that's part of the answer, but what do you think? I mean, you're trying to advocate just as much as I am for these conversations.
Yeah, but I also think that the perspective that I'm coming from it differs, because on my role, I'm supporting people in preparing for death, and everybody's journey to how they get there is totally individual, and my job is just to meet the person where they are. You know, I'm rarely saying, hey, here's something you should really look at. Except for if I'm on a stage here, and then I can say clearly, y'all are gonna die, so please think about it, okay? But with an individual, I'm just showing up to support them. You know, I meet them where they are. That means I meet them in their grief. I meet them when they're ready to be in conversation about it. I can name an experience that I'm seeing that somebody's having that could be supportive at times. But I do my best to allow them to be on their path and to hold their hand while they do it. But it's different because of the perspective I'm coming from.
Thank you both for shining a light on this really complicated and beautiful subject. My question to you, the note card was such an interesting concept, and I am a single mother. I have an 18-year-old and a 13-year-old and an 87-year-old mom, and we're a very close family. And I'm looking at that of how to prepare my kids. And I was youngish when my dad died, but that relationship. So I'm sort of curious, the kind of before and after.
I'll let you start this one.
The note card, how to prepare your children, how to prepare your children for your death or their grandmother. Okay. Well, I think as Claire was saying before, it's so important just to be real about what's happening or how people are feeling. End-of-life preparations look like a lot of things. Would that be useful if I talk a little bit about those? Okay. For starters, I think it's really important to start thinking about who you want to make your decisions for you in the event that you can't, and your desires for life support. So essentially an advance directive, if you're not familiar with it already. Think also very clearly about how you want to be treated nearing the end of your life. These are all things to share with your mother if you haven't done some of these things yet. It's important that we think about our body and services that we might want, to consider our possessions and what will happen with them after we die. Our dependents and pets, don't forget about pets or any disabled adults that are under our care. And also to think about all of our important biographical information and documents and make sure we have those someplace close. All those things would go on a note card for me to pass to somebody before the death occurs. Because once the person dies, all that information dies along with them, and then we're trying to make decisions in their absence. So for me, those would be a note card prior to a death. After a death, I think step one, your dad was really spot on. Call a mortuary. Step two, smoke a cigarette. Step three, assemble a team. Assemble a team to the extent that you can to have other people to lean on for this process. It's a difficult one. The bureaucratic, logistical nightmare that happens after a death, I think it's like grief on grief on grief on grief. It's like you're not trying to talk to the DMV when you're not grieving, let alone when you are. The joint is brutal. It's just impossible. So assemble a team for some support, and then start making a very clear checklist about the things that actually need to get done afterward. We have resources that go in with Grace to support if you're interested in how to wrap up affairs after somebody dies. It's more than a note card. It's
I hope so.
Yeah, it's about 40 pages. It's a workbook to help people work through that. Did I understand the spirit of your question? Yeah. Okay.
I'll add on to it.
Okay,
I think
thank you.
like thinking about your mom and your kids, like what questions does everybody have? You know, ask your kids, what questions do you have about death, dying, yours, theirs, hers, you know? What questions does your mom have? What questions do you have? Getting really clear with that. I think so often we avoid those questions because they're scary. They bring up a lot of emotion. I have sat and worked through a lot of my end-of-life stuff and written down things that I really want, you know, basic stuff, passwords, and accounts, and all that jazz, but also like what I want my kids to know about me, or objects and special things I want them to have, or places that they can go to think about me. And I wept as I wrote this. You know, it was so sad and hard to think about. But then after I did it, I felt a lot of relief. Like, I was so glad it was done. I can die now. I'm good, you know? I mean, not really, but it, you know, it's actually really helpful. I think there's this wading into the scary emotional space of going into that stuff, and then there's such relief, and it's also such a gift to your loved ones. I cannot tell you how many of my clients are trying to sort through either awful paperwork because nothing was put in place. No, you know, nobody had put their wishes in place. Sometimes people don't even know if their person wanted to be cremated or buried, or, you know, advance directives weren't done. There's so much that that grieving people have to sort through, and if you can do any of that beforehand for them, it is such a gift.
I agree. Did we get to the spirit of your question now? Okay, thank God.
I think you might call that an ethical will.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah.
So my question is, I think there's obviously a very different way for people that are dealing with an ongoing loss where the people are still alive. Can you talk a little bit more about how that grieving process is different?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's so many ways in which we can lose people before they're physically dead and gone. And there's a lot of grief that comes with that. Some of the grief that comes with that is not simple, but it's there and it's easy to identify. And then some of that grief is more anticipatory, what it will feel like after they're gone, kind of worrying about that. And some of that comes with so much uncertainty and anxiety. I think letting yourself grieve as much as you can and need to before they're gone, but also taking care to be really present to the moment and taking care of yourself. I think mindfulness is really wonderful and helpful in those states of anticipatory grief. You know, really, we spend so much time in the past and we spend so much time in the future. Bringing all of your awareness to the present moment and just being here, even if it's just simple breathing exercises or meditation, we're always going to be spinning out in those two different places. So even just bringing yourself to that moment a few times a day can really help balance.
I use a practice often called finding your feet, which is pretty simple, but just to notice where your feet are. If you can feel them and you have access to them, wiggle your toes around in your shoes, put some pressure against the ground, put the pressure against the bottom of your shoes, spread them out in your socks, whatever. Whenever you're doing anything with your feet at all, I like to remember that these feet have carried me places, but right now they are just right here.
You're just showing off your shoes.
That too. Also. And I think I generally have a great collection of shoes, so maybe this is why I enjoy the process so much. But while finding our feet, it reminds us that the body is here. The mind can travel, as Claire was saying. It can go in the future, it can go in the past, it can be that thing that you said in the third grade that you still haven't forgiven yourself for, but the body is always going to be here, always going to be here. And so in the anticipatory grief space, when people are elsewhere and getting caught up in it, finding your feet can be really, really useful exercise.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the spiritual side of grief. I know a lot of people, when they lose someone, they talk about a veil and that person communicating with them, or feeling like they're getting signs, and that is part of the process, I know, in the beginning of surviving the trauma of it. But I'm just wondering if either of you have any insights about that, what you've learned. And
Yeah, I think it's a part in the beginning about surviving it, but I think it's also a long-term part of carrying that grief and honoring your relationship. I think that it's almost its own stage of grief is kind of moving into this spiritual realm of all these questions that you may have. I think we go through this experience early in grief where the physical relationship with that person has been severed, and it's so exquisitely painful to know that you're never going to touch them again or hear their voice or have them walk into a room or be able to call them. And when we really start to reckon with that, it's really hard not to ask, like, but where are they? And what happens and why do we die? And all of these things. And those answers are different for everybody. I think it's important to ask them. I think it's important to sit with them. Whatever you need to do to support yourself in that spiritual inquiry is really important as well, whether it's talking to a rabbi or a priest or, going to a temple, like whatever you need to do to kind of really open up that realm for yourself. What I think is really important, and it doesn't have to be necessarily spiritual, but creating and developing an ongoing relationship with the person that we lost. That's a part of kind of carrying your grief into your life with you for a long time. I think it's a really important part of the healing. I think we assume when the person dies that the relationship is over, but it's not. We're always in relationship with the people that we love. There's an internal version of them. I always give the example that, my mom's been gone for 27 years now, but I knew her so well, and we had such a great relationship that I could think of almost any question I could ask her right now, and I can hear what her answer would be. I use the example a lot of like, what would she like what I'm wearing? Tonight, yes, but most of the time, no. She loved fashion, and most of the time she would just think I'm wearing too much gray. But she'd be pleased. But I dressed up for Alua. But I mean, I think it's important that we can still commune with them. We don't have to know where they are. We don't have to have a certain belief, but we can cultivate that internal relationship with them. And I think finding ways to honor the people that we've lost and loved is a really important part of that too. I met with a rabbi for a year when I was working on a book about the afterlife. I'm not Jewish, but we met and we spoke a couple times a month, and his parents had also died around the same time mine had when we were both young, and we had such different experiences of our grief. But one of the things he told me that has always stayed with me is that in Judaism, there's not a big emphasis on where we go in the afterlife. It's more about what we've left behind, the legacy we've left behind, the good deeds we did here, or the ways that we instilled values in others, and we can carry those things down. And I have 3 kids who have never met my parents, yet I feel like I have brought my parents into their lives in so many ways by just embodying all the values and beliefs that they had, and that's their afterlife, So there's so many ways to think about spirituality and grief, and we could talk about psychic mediums all night, but we're not going to. But there's just so many ways, but I want to leave you with the idea that it doesn't have to be anything, necessarily woo-woo or particular religion, that you can have your own relationship with the people that you've loved and lost, and you can cultivate it in so many different ways.
I'm not even going to try. Excellent work. She said it so well.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I have a question specifically around anger in grief. I know as women we get a lot of conditioning that anger might not be appropriate or we can't express anger. I know everyone's grief journey is a little bit different, but what if maybe we don't feel that anger phase, or we maybe can't access it? I would love to just hear your thoughts on that topic. Thank you.
Yeah. Anger is very individual. Some people don't feel it. I never felt a lot of anger at other people. I felt anger at myself. That's a different way we can also feel anger. We can feel anger at higher power. We can feel angry at medical professionals who were involved in end of life. We can feel angry at our siblings, our family members who have different reactions to things. But some of us don't sit in anger in grief, and that's okay. I think that there is some anger that's very valid and warranted and justified, and I think often there is anger that is being used to cover up other emotions. I think when we peel up the lid of anger, there's almost always sadness or fear underneath it. and we're afraid to sit with those things and face them. So we stew in anger. It's such a powerful emotion. It feels good. It's way more satisfying than crying, sad, So we stay in anger sometimes. I think that we're socialized in different genders to feel angry or not, So I think that there's some people feel permission to feel it where others don't. But I think that anger can be useful in some ways. It's a very powerful emotion, and it can be used as a motivating force. But I do think that whenever we're feeling a lot of anger, or even some, it's important to just think about what might be underneath it and to explore that. And maybe someone who's not feeling angry is very willingly sitting in some of those other emotions like sorrow and fear, and they're having an easier time residing there.
Do you find anger or the expression of any emotion that is outside of the things that maybe we're comfortable with, is that a conscious way of grieving?
Yeah, I think we have to show up and meet ourselves wherever it is. I think what's important is to be curious about it. It doesn't matter what the emotion is. If that's what's coming out, great, meet yourself there. Be curious about it. Be curious about what's underneath it. Be curious about why that's what's coming up for you. Be curious about if there are other things you could be holding at the same time with it. But I don't think it helps to deny or try to push away or try to be something else than what you are.
I think that's probably a pretty great place to end. Thank you, Sarah.